The kitchen window was sweating from the heat of the stove, and I remember the sound of my father's thumbnail scraping across the rim of his coffee cup. He had not raised his voice. My father almost never did. He looked at me across that table, past the steam, and told me something I thought was one of the hardest things I had ever heard from a married man. He said I should never defend my wife in a room where she had not asked me to speak. I was 26 then, married long enough to believe I understood loyalty, young enough to think loyalty always meant stepping forward. I remember leaving his house angry with him. Years later, in a meeting room with 8 men watching me and my wife sitting beside me in complete silence, I finally understood what he meant. By then, I had already done the damage. My name is Jonas. I am a husband, a father, and a man who has spent most of his life learning that leading a household is not the same thing as speaking the loudest for it. I share these stories because there are parts of our life that look simple from the outside and are much less simple when you are the one sitting at the table. If you have ever tried to protect someone you love and later wondered whether you helped them or only made yourself feel useful, tell me in the comments. That question has stayed with me for a long time. I had been married to my wife for a little more than 4 years when my father gave me that warning. We had 2 children then, both small enough that there was always a wooden toy underfoot or a damp mitten drying near the stove. I was working 6 days, most weeks, between our small acreage and a carpentry shop owned by a cousin of mine. My wife carried more than I understood at the time. She kept the garden, mended shirts, canned enough beans and tomatoes to take us through winter, cared for the children, and somehow knew when an older neighbor needed a loaf of bread before anybody had told her. I loved her. I respected her. But in those early years, I had a very simple picture in my head of what a good husband did. If something threatened the family, he stood in front of it. If someone spoke unfairly about his wife, he corrected them. If there was a disagreement, he carried the weight so she did not have to. It sounded noble to me. It also made me feel strong. Those are not always the same thing. The conversation with my father began because of something small. A woman in our district had made a remark after a gathering about the way my wife had handled a disagreement between 2 children. It was nothing that would matter now. At the time, I was hot over it. I told my father I planned to speak with the woman's husband the next time I saw him. My father listened while I explained the whole thing. I expected him to nod. Instead, he asked whether my wife wanted me to do that. I said that did not matter. I said a husband ought to defend his wife whether she asked for it or not. That was when he put down his cup and gave me the sentence I carried wrongly for years. Never defend your wife in a room where she has not asked you to speak. I heard only the first part. Never defend your wife. I thought he was telling me that peace with the community mattered more than loyalty at home. I thought it was the advice of a man from an older generation who had learned to swallow every conflict until he no longer knew what he believed. I did not ask him what he meant. That was my first mistake. My father had been married more than 30 years by then. He had buried a baby with my mother. He had rebuilt a barn after a fire. He had watched 2 sons grow into men who did not always take his advice. He knew something about standing beside another person that I did not, but I was not interested in learning it that afternoon. I wanted agreement, and when he did not give it to me, I mistook wisdom for weakness. For a while, nothing happened that forced me to revisit it. My wife and I had normal disagreements. There were bills we had to stretch, sick children, wet hay, tools that broke when there was no money for replacements. There were also good seasons. One autumn, we put up more than 200 jars from the garden and orchard. I built a new table for our kitchen from maple I had saved for almost a year. Our 3rd child was born. Life kept moving. Then came the winter I am speaking about now. It had been a difficult year before the cold even arrived. Work at the shop had slowed. A horse went lame and needed care we had not expected. My wife had taken on extra sewing for 2 families, and I did not realize how tired she had become because she rarely complained. Around the same time, there was a disagreement involving a young woman from another family who had been helping my wife with some sewing. The young woman stopped coming to our house. People began to ask why. I will not give every detail because some things belong to that young woman and still do. But the disagreement was not scandalous. It was a private matter, the kind that should have been handled by a few people who knew the truth and cared about each other. Instead, as often happens in small communities, pieces of it traveled farther than the truth did. By January, a few people had decided my wife was responsible for the young woman's decision to stop helping. One Sunday afternoon, a man I had known most of my life mentioned it to me near the barn. He did not accuse her outright. That would have been easier. He said he had heard there had been trouble in our house. The word trouble stayed with me. I asked where he had heard it. He became vague. I went home with my jaw tight enough that it hurt. My wife could tell I was upset. I told her what had been said. She looked down at the dough she was kneading and then kept working. I asked whether she wanted me to speak to the man. She said she did not. Not in those exact words, because I am not going to put words in her mouth now that she did not give me to share, but her meaning was clear. She wanted the matter to die. She believed the people who needed to know the truth already knew it. She did not want the young woman discussed any further. I heard her. I just did not accept what I heard. That is a difficult thing to admit. I told myself I was protecting her reputation. I told myself a rumor left alone becomes a story, and a story becomes what people remember. I told myself she was too tired to fight for herself. All of that sounded reasonable inside my own head. The part I did not say was that I could not stand the thought of another man believing something false about my household. Her pain had become tangled up with my pride. I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. 2 weeks later, there was a meeting about an entirely different matter. 8 men were there, including the bishop, 2 ministers, and several heads of households. It was held in a plain back room after the evening meal. The room smelled of wool coats drying near the stove and the faint, sharp scent of kerosene from a lamp on the wall. Snow had been tracked across the floor and melted into dark marks on the boards. My wife was present for the first part because the original matter involved several families, including ours. I remember sitting beside her on a wooden bench. Her hands were folded in her lap. I could feel that she was tense, even though we were not touching. The discussion moved along quietly. Then one of the men made a passing remark about how misunderstandings had already caused enough trouble that winter. He did not say my wife's name. He did not even look at her. But I knew what he meant, or at least I believed I did. I felt that old heat rise in me. There are moments when a decision seems to happen before you have chosen it. I leaned forward and began speaking. I said there had been no trouble in our house. I said my wife had been treated unfairly. I said people had repeated things without knowing what they were talking about. Then, because I wanted to prove my point, I explained more of the private disagreement than anyone in that room needed to hear. I did not use every name, but I gave enough details that everyone understood. The room became very still. That should have stopped me. It did not. I kept going. I believed silence meant I was finally making them listen. What it really meant was that I had taken something private and placed it in the middle of a room where it could never become private again. When I finished, I looked toward my wife. I expected relief, maybe gratitude. What I saw was a face I had never seen on her before, not anger. Anger would have been easier. She looked exposed. Her shoulders had drawn inward, and her eyes were fixed on the floorboards between her shoes. In that moment, my father's warning came back to me, word for word, and for the first time I heard the end of it. In a room where she has not asked you to speak, the meeting continued, but I remember almost none of it. The stove ticked as the iron cooled. Somebody moved a chair. Snow slid from the roof outside with a soft, heavy sound. My mind had gone backward 4 years to my father's kitchen. I understood too late that he had never been telling me not to stand beside my wife. He had been telling me there are different ways to stand beside a person, and sometimes the loudest one is the least faithful. When we walked home, the snow was deep enough to come over the tops of my boots in places. The moon made the road look blue. My wife walked half a step ahead of me. I wanted to explain myself. I wanted to say I had meant well. Those words were already forming in my mouth when I realized how useless they were. Good intentions do not return privacy once you have spent it for someone else. I had defended her reputation by telling a room full of people things she had specifically wanted kept quiet. I had made myself the center of a hurt that was not mine. At home, I hung my coat on its peg and stood near the kitchen door while she checked on the children. Our youngest was asleep with one bare foot outside the blanket. I pulled the blanket back over him and sat at the table. I do not remember how long I sat there. The lamp burned low. There was a crack in the wood stove that made a faint whistle when the wind came from the north. I kept thinking about the difference between protection and possession. A man can begin with the desire to protect his wife, and without noticing, start behaving as though every problem that touches her belongs to him. That is not respect. Respect leaves room for another adult to decide what she wants said, what she wants kept private, and what kind of help she actually needs. I had not done that. In the days afterward, the hardest part was not that my wife was furious with me. She was not. The hardest part was that she became careful with me. There is a difference. Before that meeting, if something troubled her, she would often tell me while we were finishing evening work. Afterward, there were pauses. I could see her deciding how much to say. That change was small enough that nobody else would have noticed it. I noticed. Trust rarely breaks with the sound people expect. Sometimes it does not break at all. Sometimes it simply narrows. A door that used to open wide begins opening only a few inches. You can still speak through it, but you remember what it was like before. I wanted to fix it quickly. That was another lesson. Some things cannot be repaired by one apology because the mistake was not one sentence. The mistake was the belief underneath it. I had believed being a husband gave me the right to decide how my wife's story should be handled. I had to change that belief, and she had to see the change long enough to trust it. So I stopped asking whether she had forgiven me. I stopped explaining why I had done it. When something came up, I asked what she wanted from me. Sometimes she wanted my opinion. Sometimes she wanted me to speak. Sometimes she wanted me to do nothing except listen while she sorted out her own thoughts. That last one was the hardest for me at first. Doing nothing can feel like failure to a man who has built his identity around solving things. But listening is not doing nothing. Keeping another person's confidence is not doing nothing. Letting your wife choose her own words is not standing aside. I visited my father several weeks after the meeting. It was late February. The snow along his lane had turned gray at the edges, and water dripped steadily from the eaves. He was in the workshop sharpening a plane iron. I stood there longer than necessary, watching him work. I wanted to tell him he had been right. Pride makes even simple sentences heavy. He did not make it easier for me. He just kept drawing the blade across the stone. Finally, I told him what had happened. I told him I had spoken for my wife when she had asked me not to. I told him I had thought his warning meant a husband should stay silent when his wife was mistreated. I told him I understood now that he meant something different. My father did not smile. He did not say, "I told you so." He rinsed the stone, dried the blade, and went back to work. That was enough. Later, I learned more about why he had given me that advice. When he and my mother were young, he had made his own version of the same mistake. The details were theirs, so I will not tell them as though they belonged to me. What mattered was that he had once confused defending my mother with deciding for her. He knew the cost because he had paid it himself. The warning, I thought, came from coldness, had come from regret. That changed the way I remembered him. Fathers sometimes hand their sons rules without telling them where the rule came from. Sons sometimes reject those rules because they cannot see the scar underneath. I wish I had asked one more question that day in his kitchen. I wish I had said, why? One word might have saved my wife a humiliation she never asked for, but regret is only useful if it changes what you do next. Our marriage did not collapse because of that meeting. Life is usually less dramatic than the stories people tell about it. We kept raising children. We kept working. We laughed again. We disagreed again. Years passed. But I became slower before speaking for her, especially in front of other people. If somebody brought me a concern involving my wife, I learned to say I would speak with her first. If she told me about a problem, I learned not to treat it automatically as an assignment. Sometimes I still failed. I am not telling you I became a perfect husband because I learned one lesson in a cold room. I am telling you I finally understood what the lesson was. There is a kind of pride that dresses itself as protection. It says, I will handle this for you. It says, nobody speaks about my family that way. It can sound honorable. Sometimes it even is honorable. But if the person you are protecting has asked you not to speak and you speak anyway, you may not be defending them anymore. You may be defending your own need to be the defender. Those are different things. I think about that now when my children come to me with problems. As a father, the instinct is still there. Fix it. Confront somebody. Make the path clear. But children grow. Wives are not children at all. The people we love need our strength, but they also need our restraint. They need to know we can carry what they tell us without immediately turning it into action. That kind of trust is quiet. You do not get praised for it. Nobody sees the conversation you choose not to have or the argument you choose not to start. But those choices can protect a household more than a loud defense ever could. What I understand now is simple. Standing beside your wife does not always mean standing in front of her. Sometimes it means asking what she needs and believing her answer, even when every part of you wants to do something else. My father knew that because he had learned it painfully. I learned it painfully too. I hope my sons do not have to. If stories like this help you understand the quieter parts of Amish family life, you can subscribe and come back for the next one. And I would like to ask you something specific before you go. Have you ever tried to defend someone you loved, only to realize later that what they needed most was for you to listen? If you have, I would be interested to hear what that taught you.